that we're gonna fall in love. I don't care about you and him. I don't care about what has been. I only care about your soft skin. Cause we're still sleeping in my head. I don't care about you and him. I don't care about what has been. I only care about your soft skin. Cause we're still sleeping in my head.
Hey, hello, I'm JulieJo. Welcome to my channel. If you're new here, welcome. I'm so glad that you're here. If you're not new here, welcome back. Feel free to hit the like button. You can hit the subscribe button if you like videos on scams, MLMs, cults, religious cults, things of that nature. And you can hit the bell button if you want to get notified when I post. I am so excited for this video. I have an interview with someone named Aryn with an A. It's about a religious cult called the Iblp. You might know them from a very famous TV show called 19 Kids and Counting, or from the previous allegations and criminal acts of one of their sons named Josh Duggar. He is now in prison for those acts. And the thing is, that's not rare for this cult. And today, Aryn is going to talk about her experience in the Iblp. It can be quite triggering, so I want to warn you, trigger warnings for SA, unaliving, I mean, just so much. But this story is incredible. There's so much to it that needs to be told. And the Iblp needs to be held accountable for their actions. So I'm very, very honored to show you my interview with Aryn. Enjoy. Hello, Aryn.
Hi.
Thank you so much for coming.
Of course.
Today's interesting. For those watching, this is not an MLM video. If you don't know, I do cult videos as well. If you see some dogs jump in, that's great. We love it on this channel. And this is Aryn. She was a part of the Iblp group. If you don't know what that is, it's the Institute in Basic Life Principles. It's a lot of stuff, and Aryn is gonna do her best to explain that to us. Tell us a little bit about her experience and like what she went through. So I think we should just jump in, and
Okay.
I want to say thank you for coming. And
Of course.
I know it's not easy, but a lot of people are gonna see this and learn and be grateful for this interview, because we do a lot of these in-depth things sometimes from people who've been a part of something like the Iblp, which has quite a history of like allegations and accusations of things.
Yeah.
And so we'll get started, and I want to start with, what is the Iblp? Right? Like, a little bit more, you've been in it. What is it?
Yeah. So it has been popularized by the show 19 Kids and Counting, because the Duggars are a part of the Iblp. So that's kind of how people outside of the world know about it. It is an international, in my opinion, cult. Was founded by this man named Bill Gothard. And the story that they told us, and is on their website, if you go look, it's there. He was 15 years old in high school, and he saw his peers making unwise decisions, and he felt called by God to dedicate the rest of his life to helping young people make wise decisions. So the word wise has a really difficult meaning for me now, because he saw what normal 15-year-olds do in high school, right, as unwise. And so there's kind of this running theme of you can't be like what normal 15-year-olds would be. So he dedicated the rest of his life to helping people, I guess, in that way. And he created this daily discipline. I use a lot of air quotes. He created this.
Me too.
It just like, because it's so, when you look at it from an outsider's perspective, it is insane. But when you're in it, this is just what normal life is. So basically, you rise early, like if you're a holy person or a wise person, you're going to rise early, get up before the sun, and spend that time reading scripture, memorizing scripture, meditating on scripture. And I don't understand what that means even now. and then of course tithing. You have to give 10% of your money back to Bill Gothard, or whatever church you're a part of. And he basically credits this, and on the website it says there's a direct correlation between him memorizing and meditating scripture and him being able to pass high school in the honor society. So apparently he failed first grade, and then was on probation, I guess, for the rest of the time. So probably he was just a kid who was struggling. And then he started memorizing and meditating scripture, and then he passed high school on the honor society. And
interesting. That's
yeah,
interesting.
yeah, yeah.
That process.
Yeah. And the words direct correlation, I was like, I do not think that means what you think it means. And so then he carried it on through college and graduate school. And then he created basically like he taught other people how to do this. And then college I believe it was Wheaton College, asked him to create a college course, which then turned into an entire institute, which is what it is now. And it is basically like full of curriculums that teach people how to I believe the way that they word it is how to like love God with your whole mind, body, spirit, soul, something like that. And yeah, and then it is really weird because they have this thing called alert. Do you know what this is?
Okay. Yes, I've heard about it. I think weren't some of the Duggars kids like in it? Is this like a school? This is like a school, right?
It is.
But
it is like a military school.
Okay.
It is a paramilitary. They train boys, like I'm talking like 13, 14, 15. ALERT stands for Air Land Emergency Resource Team.
Gotcha.
And they basically train boys to be in the military in case, somebody comes and invades the US and the government needs help from godly boys to go fight their war.
Isn't there a military already?
I don't, but it's not godly.
Oh, there it is.
So it's not created by godly people. So
I see. Wow.
Yeah, so there's the alert. So that's the paramilitary. My brother went for I think he did like an alert camp, which is like a mini version of it. And my parents even I'm not going to give a ton of credit to my parents, but in some ways they were like, oh, that seems a little interesting, and we're not really going to go down that route. And so they did like little mini camps, and then they were like, that seems like a little extreme. But we still didn't get out of the cult. We just like didn't delve into like the extreme versions of it, I guess, in some areas.
Yeah, that's good. That's good.
To an extent, yes.
Yeah, I think that, there's brainwashing all over, but especially when you like get into those extremes,
Mm-hmm.
I think it gets way worse in there too.
Mm-hmm.
So I just have a few questions. Yeah. Do you have trouble sleeping in now?
Mm-hmm.
Because what you said, you got out when you were 15, and so all that time, they would wake you up at what time was it?
It depended, but usually we were up by 6 a.m. Like that was the goal. And the holier you were, the earlier you woke up. So like my dad would wake up at 4 a.m. and he would talk about like he prayed for hours, and he would like go and walk our property. He would walk the outskirt of our property and like pray about putting like he called it a hedge of thorns and a wall of protection around our property so that nothing could come in. And so he would be up at like 4 a.m. I would try to get up at 6 a.m. I also I've had issues like with sleeping my whole life, because I couldn't sleep I couldn't fall asleep. I have really bad insomnia. But also we would have to get up super early. So I would just always be tired. And you get up to like read the Bible. I vividly remember one day I woke up at like 6 a.m. and I literally passed out because like I stood up to get my Bible off of my dresser and I woke up 10 seconds later on my back on my bed.
They do it to a point of exhaustion. Like it feels like you're always exhausted all the time is kind of what I'm getting. And that actually is a form of control, you know, like, because you're more vulnerable then they're able to like mold you more. So wow, that's extreme. That's pretty extreme.
Yeah. And it was, my parents will probably say that they never forced that on us. But they did really encourage it by my dad getting up at 4 a.m. every day to go pray. And he was like this really amazing holy man, right? And so, and the whole goal of your existence was to become the holiest you possibly could. And so they, you know, they'll say like, we didn't force you to do that, but it was highly encouraged to. And when you're already in a controlling environment, you do whatever you can to stay on the good side of whoever's controlling you. So
kind of voluntold. You're voluntold.
Oh yeah. Yeah.
So before we move on deeper, I want to ask, was it your parents that joined or was it like your grandparents? Okay. How did that happen? How did they get in?
It is a weird, so it's a weird story. I have 10 siblings, first of all. So that's a big important part of this, which is very common in the IBLP. Everybody has a ton of kids. My parents always wanted to homeschool their children. And so they got sucked into the IBLP through that door. And so they were looking for Christian curriculums. And they kind of got sucked into it. I have some opinions. My dad is not a great person at all. Like, he's a really bad person. I believe that part of the reason why we got sucked into the cults as deeply as we did was because it gave him a place to be who he is without consequence.
That is an excellent point. I think that happens for a lot of people. Like, they join it because they see that they can be who they are. And Bill Gothard didn't even really have many consequences at first whenever I just read about it. That's why it's so fresh in my mind.
We'll get to that part. That's really interesting. So we got kind of like in there. They went to a lot of like homeschool conferences and stuff. And at the time, IBLP was really, really popular in homeschooling circles because of their entire curriculum is based off of scripture. So you don't really learn anything that isn't really talked about in scripture. And so everything that you do learn is from that lens. So even if we had science books to learn,
I was about to ask about that.
It was all creation based. Every single chapter talked about God. And this is just a funny thing. My parents glued the pages together in the anatomy and physiology book that talked about genitals.
Wow.
Yep, because we weren't supposed to read about that and about sex and reproduction. They like glued it together. So all of our curriculums were either directly written by Bill Gothard or someone on his team or highly recommended by IBLP. So we did have some, like Bob Jones University had a homeschooling curriculum that we used some of. Focus on the Family had some stuff.
Yeah, I've heard about Bob Jones. I've heard about Focus on the Family. Very much IBLP vibes. Like, I feel like they're all on the same wavelength of cults, you know? So
absolutely. They're all very connected. I don't know if Focus on the Family still sells IBLP material anymore after Bill Gothard got kicked out, which is shocking to me that even happened, but they turned him into a scapegoat. So, that happens often. So that's how we got drawn in. And then I don't remember a time before IBLP, but I do remember after and all during. And there's so much.
Yeah. So I'm so pumped to get into like the meat of it all. I want to ask, you mentioned it a little bit, but tell me a little bit about like the doctrines and the beliefs of the IBLP. Like what makes people go, that's a cult? You know, like
yeah. So it's very interesting. One of the things, I went back and read their statement of faith that you can find on their website, and it is scary. Some of it is very normal for Christian, right? It's very much, we believe in God the Father and like, you know, Jesus, Holy Spirit, and that whole Trinity. Obviously, I've been out for a while, so I don't remember the exact details of it. So some of it is real. They talk about creation, but the one sentence that stood out to me, they talk about, first they preface by saying, we believe that Satan is a living being who, in the end times, like he has hell, right? That is like full of lakes of fire, and it is there to punish unbelievers for eternity. So that is, and then the next statement is, we believe that you must abstain from any compromise with unbelief. So that's where the information control comes in for us. So how that is translated in IBLP from everybody that I have known was, you don't associate with anybody outside of this belief system, because you could compromise yourself and could compromise your belief. And so that's where the information control comes in. That's where like the big cult part of it comes in, because we did not have friends outside of homeschoolers. We believed that public school was evil. We believed that you could not be a Christian and put your children in public school. We believed that like if you did that, you were exposing them to unbelief, and like that would compromise their soul and they could go to hell for all of eternity.
Pretty much like brimstone, fire and brimstone.
Oh, very,
like,
very much.
Mongering. Wow, that's really intense.
It was terrifying as a child. And so there's those statements, those doctrines, and then the one that has been clearly updated within the last, I would say 5 years, because it was not this detailed at the time, but it says that we believe that God created like people to either be male or female. We believe that marriage is between one person born a man and one person born a female. Like they're very specific in their language. And they then group all sexual sin is under the same label. So being gay, which I am, and being a pedophile and having sex outside of marriage and kissing outside of marriage and bestiality, all under the same, this is sin. You cannot even think about all of that.
Wow. That's wild, especially considering what we know about Bill Gothard.
Yes.
Yes. I did not know that like that all of that was under the same umbrella. I mean,
it's all the same.
Wow.
Sin is sin. So in this aspect, sin is sin, which means that if I were to lie, right, that is at the same level as my father being a pedophile. Like that is equal sin.
Wow.
And so that is terrifying as a child, if you can imagine. Like, yes. If I lie, if I don't say something correctly, I'm going to go to hell and be in a lake of fire for eternity, right?
Wow. How do you feel like that has affected you today? Because I feel like as a child, you're scared all the time. How do you feel like that's affected you today?
So, so you said that. You said the piece, as a child, you're scared all the time. And that is all I remember about childhood. That's it. I was terrified my entire life. My parents had me convinced at a very young age that I was possessed by a devil. They will also say that they did not tell me that, right? They did not do that. They did not pressure me in that. But the way that they taught it in my little 8-year-old, 6-year-old brain meant I'm possessed by a devil because I'm scared all the time. And people who are Christians, good Christians, and have good faith are not scared, right? And so now there's a lot of like, I don't believe in Satan. I don't believe in hell. But there are parts of my brain and my nervous system that still do.
I can relate to that. Absolutely. And you know, you kind of just stop yourself in your tracks, right? When you're having those moments and just be like, nope, that's not real. You're right. Like that's not it. Wow.
It's a conscious conversation that I have to have with myself still sometimes. And the way that it impacted me in my early adulthood is really interesting because when I was 15 years old, I decided God wasn't real, like in my head. Like that was a very big reality to me. And then my mom filed for divorce when I was 15 or 16. And I was like, oh, that's my fault because I don't believe that God exists anymore. And so then I tried really hard after that to continue to believe in God. But there was like this cognitive dissonance in my head because I felt so abandoned by this God that I had been taught about. And then was being taught that he's supposed to be this loving, amazing God. But my dad is who he is. We were in a cult for my whole life growing up. I am gay, and that is a really interesting part of the story. But I didn't believe I could be, right? Like that, you can't, in that circle, you can't be. That's not a thing. And I tried to go back to church as an adult. And every time I walked into church, I would have panic attacks. My entire nervous system would just freak out. And the way that what's different about evangelical churches compared to fundamentalist is that evangelical tends to be very outwardly and emotional and like a visible display of worship or emotion. And as a child, I was always taught not to express my emotions and not to, I have big emotions. I have always had big emotions. I express them in a very big way and have always done that. And so that drew me into evangelical churches, and because I could express my emotion. But it turns out that my emotion was just a panic attack, and it was just my nervous system being like, no, you don't, this isn't real, this isn't okay, you are still being manipulated, just differently. It also was like the control aspect and looking for community outside of a cult was what pulled me into MLMs, and I had been a part of at least 3 by the time I was 25. And we all know how that goes. There's no community in MLMs.
Okay, so one point, and what you were saying just now, you said that your parents implied, right, that you were possessed.
Yeah.
Because you were afraid, right? Because what they taught you and what Iblp taught you scared you, but they acted like it was your fault.
Yeah.
So tell me more about that.
Yeah. So one of the main teachings of the Iblp is that men are basically right underneath God and women are submissive and quiet. You are a wife and a mother, and that is the extent of your purpose on earth. I'm gay. I was never going to be a wife or a mother in the main source of it. And I never wanted to be. And so that was like, and I'm also not a quiet person. I express myself. I talk about my feelings. I feel my feelings in a very big way. And I always have. And so that was constantly drilled into me that I was not holy because I could not be quiet and submissive. I was a problem child because I could not be quiet and submissive. What is really interesting is that my parents bought into this really interesting aspect. There is this man called Dr. Henry Wright, and I would like to clarify he is not, or was not, he has since passed, but he was not a doctor. He had an honorary doctorate in therapeutic counseling from some college that I don't know. But you should look into him because he's interesting. He wrote this book called I wrote that, I need to look at my notes. A more excellent way. And his ministry is called Be in Health Ministries. This book I have since, you can get a PDF from the internet, which don't buy this book. Please do not buy this book, but you can download a free PDF. It is the most horribly written piece of literature I have ever read in my life. There are so many typos, grammatical mistakes, just terrible. There's no flow, very repetitive. That's just my own personal issue with that. But readable.
They have all those issues.
They should be readable.
Exactly. That's what they're there for.
Yes. So the teachings in this book were that he decided, right, that God could heal any disease, but that every single disease is related to a root sin in your life that you have to take care of in order to be healed. And we are talking everything from allergies, seasonal allergies, to cancer,
oh my
heart
gosh.
disease. I need you to look up this book. It is horrible. Cancer, heart disease. Fun fact, he died from a heart attack.
Well.
Heart disease, chronic illnesses, autoimmune disorders are related to a root sin that you have to take care of. Okay? So that is to preface. My parents read this book. They bought into it hardcore. And I have chronic allergies. I am allergic to everything. I have seasonal allergies. I'm allergic to dust, because most people are. We grew up in the middle of nowhere on a gravel road. I'm allergic to dust. We grew up on a hobby farm. I am allergic to animals. I had allergies from a very, very young age. According to Dr. Henry Wright, allergies have a root sin of bitterness. And so at 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 years old, my parents told me that the reason why I had allergies was because I was a bitter child.
I have no words.
Yep. And so they told me I had to rebuke the spirit of bitterness in order to free myself of these allergies. Meanwhile, my mother, who also has chronic allergies, would take medication for her chronic allergies.
They wouldn't give you medication?
Oh, mm-mm.
Are you serious? That is bad.
I remember we never had medication. We would take oatmeal baths. We were very, very home remedy type. We had the Young Living oils were all over our house. We really on a rare occasion they would give us kids Tylenol and ibuprofen, but super, super rarely. You just kind of had to deal with whatever you had. And they never took us to the doctor. We were all immunized. That I will give them that. That is, and it's very rare, honestly, in that circle. My parents did get us all immunized for a lot of things. But we didn't go to school. So after 5 or 6, I believe that they stopped immunizing us. And so I had to get a ton as an adult before I went to college, which was super fun. So so they had this book and they would have me read it. And there were specific scriptures that had to do with being bitter. And so I believed that I had let Satan get a foothold in my life at before 10 because I was somehow this very bitter child because I had chronic allergies. The other thing that happened was that because I was so afraid all the time, I had nightmares all the time. I would like see demons in my closet, and would have to sleep with the light on, and I would have nightmares constantly. And when I would have nightmares, I would like go up to my parents' room and my dad would pray over me, but the way he prayed over me was like rebuking devils and rebuking spirits and like trying to pull them out of me basically. So like I don't want to say it was an exorcism because it wasn't, but like that's kind of
The vibe.
yes, yeah. And like he would like lay hands on me and like try to remove these spirits that were causing me to be afraid, and it just made me more scared, and I would just go back and have more nightmares. Then as I got older, I started having a lot of fear of being abandoned, and a lot of fear of like waking up and everybody would be dead or I would be the only one surviving. Like I had all of these like scenes that would play through me that I would be the only one left, which is an interesting from a psychological perspective. But and the root, like my sister had severe asthma, and the root sin related to asthma is the fear of abandonment or fear, stress, and anxiety, which is all put into the same, like fear, stress, and anxiety are all the same thing. So if you're anxious, you're just stressed. That's it. And you also shouldn't be, because if you're praying enough and you love God enough, then you won't be anxious and you won't be stressed and you won't be fearful. And so all of that led me to believe that I was possessed by some sort of demon. My parents really believed in spiritual warfare and angels and demons fighting constantly around us. And that is a terrifying thing for a child to know, that there are angels and demons. And if I sin, then I am letting the demons in. And then everything is my fault. Yeah, so that's kind of that story.
Wow. I'm curious about your sister's asthma. When she had attacks, was there any inhaler? Did they allow that? Medication?
They did. Yeah.
So I understand, like, the asthma attacks don't just go away.
No.
Right?
So my mom also has asthma, and she could have an inhaler.
So weird how that works.
Yeah, I know. Crazy, huh? I found my sister on the bathroom floor. Her face blue. She couldn't breathe during an asthma attack. And they took her to the hospital then, which again, I don't want to give them a ton of credit, but they did save her life and take her to the hospital, which is bare minimum. This is not even like, you don't give your parents credit,
that's
bare minimum. But they did. So they took her to the hospital then, and then basically the doctors were like, we're not sending you home without this. And so then she had it. But I know that they expire, don't they? Like inhalers expire. Yeah, I don't know that they ever
for them to do something about it, which is so sad. And
Yep.
not only for y'all, but for her to experience that. I just couldn't imagine.
Yep. And then there was once when my brother had pneumonia. My little brother had pneumonia, but they let it get so bad before they took him to the hospital. And then my older brother had something else, meningitis maybe? I don't know for sure, but it was really severe, and they didn't take him to the hospital until he like collapsed because it was so severe.
Oh my gosh.
So they really didn't. And what is really hard is that my mom was educated as a nurse, and before she met my dad, and before he stopped her from working, she worked as a nurse. And so she had medical education and medical background. And this was still the way that it turned out.
Wow.
Like my parents were not uneducated. My parents
that's the hard part too, right? They couldn't blame ignorance.
No.
Jeez. That is, as someone who's also in the medical field, that is something, and works in peds.
Yeah.
That is just horrific, to be honest.
Yeah.
Horrific.
And I mean, you hear stories, like we heard stories all the time about kids dying because their parents wouldn't take them to the hospital. Other people, you can cut this out, but other people you need to look into are Michael and Debbie Pearl. Have you ever heard of them? Okay, they are scary. They are really, really connected to the IBLP. They wrote a book called How to Train Up a Child or something like that.
I've heard of that book.
And it's linked to child deaths. Like their teachings are directly linked to child death. Like parents of children followed their teachings and their child died.
What's their name?
Michael and Debbie Pearl.
Actually, Pearl, I have heard of them. So in the IBLP, you mentioned child death. Is that something that occurred normally? Was it rare? Like, what's your experience with it? Did you see it often, or did you see it rarely, or did you mostly hear about it?
It was kind of like a whisper. When it happened, it was not talked about. Also, when it happened, those people were typically like, there was legal proceedings with those parents, and so at that point they were like shunned and pushed out, even though people within the community were still practicing the same things. Those people, they took it too far, you know, and so they're the rare people that took it too far. I did not hear a ton of details about these things until after I got out and I started really researching it, and looking into the stories of other people who had gotten out. What is really, really sad is that a lot of the children who experienced the worst of the abusive things were the ones that were adopted from other countries.
Oh, geez. Why do you think that is?
I have a lot of opinions. I have so many opinions. Yeah. Racism is a huge thing. The white savior complex within the IBLP is insane. They are in a lot of other countries. The biggest ones that I remember hearing about were China and Romania. And a lot of families would go and adopt Romanian kids and bring them back to the United States. And these are kids who have experienced extreme trauma, like extreme trauma. And they would bring them back to the United States, but these kids, because they had experienced extreme trauma, were not going to be well-behaved, quiet little children. And so one of the aspects of it, something that fueled a lot of the abuse, was the idea that you have to break the will of the child in order to teach them. And so these children who had severe trauma were just viewed as being willful and disobedient, and there were children who were beaten to death at 7 or 8. I know of people who were locked in basements for days with no food or water, no light, and just a friend of mine told me that her mom put her on the bottom of the basement steps and threw buckets of cold water on her, because she didn't memorize a scripture correctly.
Wow. No, I mean, that's obviously abuse, you know.
Oh, clearly.
Emotional, mental, it's all abuse. So I guess abuse was pretty prevalent in the IBL.
Oh, yeah. And not even like, I mean, we know things like spanking your child is abuse, right? We know that now. So that's just prevalent across Christianity, I feel like, for the most part. But within the IBLP, there is a strong, like, focus on breaking the will of the child, and all children are born sinful and willful, and you have to break them. And Michael and Debbie Pearl talk about beating your 6-month-old baby with a piece of like plastic pipe for moving off of a blanket. Like, they're talking about training a child from 6 months old to not crawl off of a blanket, that if you put them on a blanket, this is your square. And if they put a hand off or anything, they are instructed to beat their 6-month-old baby. Like, it is terrifying and horrible.
Yeah, that is terrifying and horrible. Holy crap.
Yes. I
was not anticipating that. I mean, it's all awful, but like,
yeah,
for an infant.
Yeah. No, because they teach that infants are willfully evil. You are born evil. and they
Okay.
have to break you in order to like save you.
So they have to abuse you and cause you trauma to save you.
Yes.
Gotcha. Wow.
100%. Yes.
Wow.
Yes.
So I know that Bill Gothard, we're gonna shift a little bit, had this thing, right? This you know what I'm talking about.
Oh yeah.
Tell me about it. Tell us about it.
So Bill Gothard, which one of the things that I wanted to say about him is that he was held up as this person who knew everything and was like basically like had a direct connection to God, but he was held up as this person who is an expert on families, on relationships, on raising children. He was never married. He never had a family. But he was considered this like expert.
Prophet. Yeah, this like prophet of
yes. So the way that I personally experienced him, I met him in person. I was 13 or 14 years old. It's a really complicated story, but my dad stopped working when I was 8 years old, and we survived on Social Security income. And you have to remember that I have 10 siblings. We survived on one person's disability because he would not let my mom work. And then and this is not really part of the cult issue, but it is connected. When we would start babysitting and stuff like that, all of our money would go to whatever he needed it for to keep the lights on. I paid to keep the lights on in our house at 14, 15 years old. I bought food for the family. We had churches donate a bunch of food to us because we were below the poverty level because we were living on one disability income. So that's important. We left a church when I was 12 or 13. The story of why we left, I don't know, to be honest. There are so many different stories, different things, but it was a very traumatic thing because that was our entire social circle. And we left and cut all ties with this church. And so we were completely isolated on a tiny farm in the middle of nowhere in Minnesota. Which meant that the things that happened in that house during that period of time were horrible.
Yeah.
At one point, somehow we got connected directly to Bill Gothard. I believe because we also had there's a Star Tribune article, which is a Minnesota newspaper, about my family that you can go and see in archives. And they came out and did a whole article about us. It's all a lie. There is very little of it that is actually true because it painted a very positive picture of what our life was that did not exist. And I believe that this is around the same time that we ended up going to headquarters, which is notorious in the IBLP for being the place where Bill Gothard did the worst of his.
Yeah.
So they paid for my whole family to drive to Chicago from Minnesota we stayed at one of their missionary houses in Chicago, and we toured headquarters and the compound area. That's where like the majority of it was based. We went to tapings of this radio show called Unshackled, which is like telling historical stories from a biblical perspective. So it's really interesting. And probably not super accurate. And then we met Bill Gothard on one of the very last days we were there. And I was too young for him. I was sitting next to my sister who was probably 17 or 18, and he came over, like he saw her from across the room, and he walked over to her and sat down next to her and started talking to her and telling her that God was calling her to go work at headquarters for him. And I remember watching, this is seared into my brain that he had his hand on her knee while he was telling her that this is where she needed to go, right? Thankfully, that did not happen. She did not go to headquarters, but that is a very common thing that Gothard would tell parents that their 17, 18, 19-year-old daughters were being called to work for him at headquarters. And then there's, of course, the stuff that came out about him after he was disgraced were that a lot of the people that worked for him, the women who worked for him, have complaints of sexual harassment, have complaints of full-on sexual abuse, sexual assault. And like, it didn't happen to me or my sisters, but it could have. And it did happen to a lot of people. And then when he was disgraced, he just kind of was able to go live in the middle of the woods, in a cabin in the woods. And that was it. Like, nothing happened to him. There's like I don't know for sure about the legal proceedings. I didn't look super deep into those. But I don't think he ever had any.
Yeah, from what I saw, it was dismissed due to statute of limitations.
Yep.
So there were 16 women and 2 men that had come out, and it was like a class action against him and what he did, and it was dismissed.
Yep. And then what was worse about that situation, not that it could get any worse, but that is not uncommon in the IBLP. But now they had a scapegoat.
Yeah.
And so they blamed everything on him, said he was this immoral person, disgraced him, and the IBLP is still running by godly men who are leading this. And my dad was considered a godly man. And he's a horrible human being. And I don't care about saying that. You can leave that in.
Yeah, no worries. I will. Yeah,
he is a disgusting human being, but he is considered a godly man. I don't know if he is still connected to the IBLP, my dad, personally. My parents got divorced when I was 15, and that was kind of the end of that. And
left IBLP? Okay.
So getting divorced in the IBLP, unheard of. My mom filed for divorce, and we were shunned from a lot of, not just the IBLP, but like Christian groups in general. I was told that I was a product of divorce, and so I could never make a good wife, which don't really care about that. But at the time, it was devastating.
Yeah.
And yeah, but that my world crumbled. And that was right after I had decided that God didn't exist. So I believed that was directly connected.
Yeah, they're like correlated. Like, you did that, essentially, is probably what you thought.
Yeah. But it's not. Like, my parents needed to get divorced. Like, that needed to happen. We needed to leave the IBLP. We needed to leave that cult. And it was very quickly after that like, my dad moved out and things changed drastically after that. Not necessarily for the better, but we weren't in the cult anymore. So that was, we didn't really talk to people. Like, as long as my parents were working on being reconciled, we were allowed to communicate with other people. But the minute my parents were divorced, like, whole families just were cut us off, and we're like, you can't speak to our children, you can't be friends with our children anymore.
Did they know what your dad was like?
I don't know. I know that I told adults in my life as a child, and I know this because I remember doing it, but also adults have come back to me and told me that I said something, and nothing happened. Nobody intervened. When my parents were getting a divorce, we had a safety plan to get out of my house in case my dad flipped a switch. And there were people who were involved in this safety plan who did nothing, who said nothing.
Yeah.
And when they were finally divorced and everything was done, my mom actually put my siblings in public school after that, and which was the culture shock for my siblings.
I can only imagine.
Like it was horrible. And I graduated high school. I should not have graduated high school. I am now in a master's program, so it doesn't matter that my high school diploma was faked, but it was.
Yeah.
I only ever took science and math. That's it.
Wow. So you had to like teach yourself English and.
I had never written a paper before I got to college.
Wow.
I had never sat in a classroom and listened to someone lecture. My mother would buy the homeschool books and give them to us. I taught my younger siblings how to read, how to do math. Like my mom kind of checked out after a couple of us. And so I and my older siblings were the teachers for everyone else, which is also a very common thing in homeschooling in general. But in the IBLP, like the girls are taught how to be mothers. And so teaching your younger siblings was a part of that. But a lot of our education stemmed around how to be a good wife and how to be a good Christian and not on anything else. And so when I entered the world, like I didn't know what I was doing. Another really interesting thing, like we've talked a lot about how men kind of get away with grooming and at the very least grooming in these circles.
Yeah.
But straight up sexual abuse, sexual assault, all of those things to children and adults. Because another thing that is taught is that wives cannot say no. You don't get to say no. It is your job to please your husband. That is what you were created for. You do not get to say no. And so that being ingrained in that area was like when I was 17 and I went into the workforce, my supervisor groomed and then sexually assaulted me. And I assumed that that was normal, that this is what men do, that this is how men treat women. I was not supposed to speak up because if I did, I would ruin his reputation. And I found out later that this man had multiple sexual harassment complaints that were all just dropped. They all just kind of disappeared.
Wow.
But he worked with children.
That's bad.
Mm-hmm.
That's bad.
Yeah. So growing up in that set me up to be abused as an adult because that's what I assumed love was. That's what I assumed men do. So there was nothing else that was taught to me that was different.
Yeah. A lot.
Yeah.
That's the word for all of this is a lot, but also important, right? What is it like for you today after your, lack of a better word, horrific upbringing in the IBLP? What is life like today? What have you had to experience? What are the positives, negatives, good, bad, whatever it is? What is it like today?
So I think I do want to focus on some of the positives. There is life after this stuff. There is hope after this stuff. And some of the things that I've experienced as an adult are just as horrific as what I experienced as a child. I also developed a severe mental disorder, like a mental health disorder from my childhood. And that is a very common thing. It is not really talked about. I have been in therapy since I turned 18 years old. Like on my birthday, and when I was an adult and able to do it myself, I started going to therapy, and I highly recommend that.
I'm guessing they don't believe in.
Oh, no. No, because it's a spirit. If you are depressed, if you are anxious, if you anything like that, it's a spirit.
It's your fault.
Yes. Oh, so one thing, I have had chronic thoughts of unaliving since I was 12 years old. That is the first time that I vividly remember having that thought because I was so sinful that I believed that that was the best way to solve the problem. That if I just wasn't there, no one else would have to deal with how sinful I was. The only thing that stopped me as a child is that if you did that, you would go to hell.
Yeah.
That is legitimately the only reason why I'm still here for that period of time. But those thoughts and those patterns carried into adulthood, and it is a very scary thing. But the mental health aspect of coming out of a cult is something that people don't really talk about often. Like, when you first come out of a cult and you've been controlled your entire life and you suddenly have to make decisions for yourself that you have never had to do before, it is terrifying, and you mess up all the time. And growing up being told that messing up means you're going to go to hell means that, for me, that has translated to, well, then I should just go. So it has been a really hard process in that way, because of that. It is also just really hard to make friends as an adult when you were not allowed to have friends as children. And that's hard for everybody, but I think especially when you've grown up so isolated and so controlled, and all of your friendships are controlled. And then you're an adult and you have to figure out, who do I want to be around? What kind of friends do I want to have? How to even be a person that exists in a healthy way is a really hard aspect of it. So I think that that's like the biggest thing that I've still dealt with. And of course, I didn't actually come out as gay until 2 years ago. And a lot of that was because of how I grew up, and because I thought, even though I didn't believe in hell, there's still that piece of me that's like, well, what if though, right? What if I am gay?
Always. Yeah.
And every decision, it's like, what if I'm wrong? What if I am just a sinful person? Like, what if I am just one of those stories and I'll still end up in hell for all of eternity? But like I said, there is hope. There is beauty that comes out of all of this stuff. And I really want to be clear that I am not, like, I've had a lot of horrible experiences with Christianity. I am not saying that Christianity is wrong. Believe what you're going to believe as long as you don't harm other people. That's my whole thing.
Absolutely.
But I will never step foot in a church again. And I don't trust Christians because I know what happens behind closed doors in those circles. I've experienced what happens behind closed doors in those circles. And so I assume now that that is just what happens. I am not a trustful person. I don't trust people.
I don't blame you. I don't blame you whatsoever.
So it is a really scary world outside of this cult. And it's scary inside the cult, but at least it's controlled, and at least it's contained, and at least you know what your life is going to be. And when you're outside of it, you have to suddenly make all those decisions for yourself. And for some people, that's a very freeing experience. And for me, it means having a panic attack going to change the thermostat, because my dad always kept it at a certain temperature and you couldn't change it. And I literally have to have conversations with myself as a whole 30-year-old adult who owns her own home, that I'm allowed to go change my own thermostat because I'm an adult and I live by myself, and
yeah,
I can do that. So it's like little things like that that like still get me sometimes, where I'm like, I can go grocery shopping because I don't like any of the food in my house. That's a thing I'm allowed to do. You know? So
the independence of it is so new. I think it's wild to experience.
And I'm 15 years out of this, and it's still hard. So people who are just coming out of it, and I know I talked about the Duggars very briefly, but the same thing that happened with Bill Gothard becoming the scapegoat happened with Josh Duggar. He became the scapegoat with his legal proceedings and all that stuff. People ask all the time why his wife doesn't leave. She can't. She has a subpar high school education at best. You are taught that in this other book called Created to be His Helpmeet, you are taught that it's like an umbrella system, and it's God and then the father and husband, and then the wife, and then the children. And if the wife steps out from underneath her husband or father, she is outside of the umbrella. She is no longer protected by God, which means she's going to hell in the lakes of fire for all of eternity. You can't do it. Also in that book, it teaches that there's literally a heading on what to do if your husband is accused and convicted of child sexual abuse. And they
what was this book again?
Created to be his helpmeet.
Helpmate?
Helpmeet, M-E-E-T.
Oh.
It is a biblical term from the King James Version, not the New King James, because that's evil, but the King James, the only one that you are allowed to read. Because all the other ones were interpreted by men, like who don't have a direct line to God like King James clearly did, right? Like,
absolutely.
Whatever. But so under this heading, it says, if your husband is convicted, like if you know that your husband has done this, you should report him. So kudos, right? Okay. However, it is your duty as a wife to maintain your relationship with said pedophile husband, go visit him in jail and in prison, and bring the children that he abused to visit him in prison and maintain the relationship between the child and their abuser, because that will help both people heal. And then when he's released, you welcome him back and you go back underneath his authority.
That's not right.
Something's
off there.
Also, if you have to have an entire heading in a book,
yes. If that's in the book, there's something wrong.
And this is happening always, everywhere. I really firmly believe that the Iblp is a place that not only is a place for pedophiles to go hide, but they raise pedophiles in the Iblp. They create pedophiles in the Iblp. There are so many more stories. I know we're at an hour, but there are so many more stories. Like I went to this thing called the Bright Lights. It's a women's only Bible study, girls only Bible study. And they teach girls that like your entire worth is held in your sexual purity, which is like very much purity culture, right? But to an extreme.
Yeah, absolutely.
So, like, you should not look at, touch, be near someone of the opposite sex, which like wasn't a problem for me because gay, but but you couldn't, because that damaged your sexual purity. And they did this one session on it where they had a heart, like a cutout heart, and they passed the heart around the circle, and every person that got it had to rip a piece off of this heart, and it got back to the leader, and they said, this is what your heart looks like if you've dated outside of marriage.
Wow. Ugh. That's kind of like, that's the horrible indoctrination of extreme purity culture.
Extreme purity culture. Yeah. We had to, like, when we would walk past Victoria's Secret in the mall, we had to make eye contact with our brothers because it was our responsibility to make sure that our brothers and our father did not look at this picture of this naked woman. Or when we were watching TV, which rarely happened, we only watched sports games, but if the cheerleaders came on in their little bikini outfits, we would have to make eye contact with our dad and our brothers to keep them from sinning. And it was our fault if men looked at us that way. But also at the same time, my mom would teach us that men are going to fantasize about you whether you're wearing a potato sack or a bikini. So men are dangerous to me. Like that is what was taught. Men will always see you as a sexual being and something to use. And
it's like they were purposely raised up in that way. Like you said, it seems like the Iblp is not past raising up pedophiles.
No, clearly. Because Josh Duggar he's not a rare case. He's just, because the Duggars were on TV, he's getting national news. But it's so common, and it's terrifying. And the stories that I know from people, like, it's so scary. But they literally have created a bubble where those kinds of people get to thrive because no one's going to report it. If you do report it, you go under church discipline, and it doesn't get reported to the authorities the majority of the time. And if it does, there's also a document that was released by, it's a fundamentalist churches that released, they not necessarily specifically IBLP, but they released all of the cases of reported sexual abuse by pastors. And it is like hundreds of people. And we're talking hundreds of people reported, as in like those are the men, hundreds of men. And then underneath each one of those, the amount of victims are insane.
That doesn't even include the ones not reported. That's something I see a lot in Christianity as a whole, but specifically like sectors like the IBLP, and is this secret, not even secret underground, but like that's the best way I can put it, of like pedophilia and it being okay. Like,
oh yeah,
that's
wow. Because it's rampant. Like it is not uncommon. And what we know about that kind of person is that they seek out people who are similar to them so that they can like hide. You know, there's and we also know that the majority of pedophiles were abused as children, right? And so when we're looking at Josh Duggar, what did he go through? Even if he was not physically sexually abused, what was he being indoctrinated with? What was he being taught? That men cannot control their sexual desires. Like that is the idea. It is on the woman to control the man's sexual desires, or to always give in to that, because, you know, but also what the woman is considered impure as soon as that happens to her. And so you are no longer worthy to be married. You are no longer worthy, like
the misogynistic
to an extreme. And I
like the laws, criminal laws.
Yes.
Like you could be put in prison forever.
The majority of the men that I met, the majority of the men that I met in that circle should be in prison forever.
I believe it. I believe it. Yeah. I have just a couple more questions.
Yeah.
So how's your relationship with your siblings and your mom?
I don't speak to my mom either, for different reasons, but she is not, I would like to be very clear that she is not the hero in this story. She did divorce my dad, but she divorced him after 25 years and having 10 children. She knew what was happening. She knew what was going on. There's no way she didn't. And to only divorce him after 25 years, like, I just don't want to give her that credit. We don't speak anymore. Yeah. I am close with my siblings. What is kind of interesting is that the majority of us are queer in some aspect, which I just find really funny in a petty way. That being taught, like drilled into us, that we cannot be queer or we will go to hell. And then so many of us are. A lot of my siblings have been to therapy. A lot of them have done a lot of work, and I'm so proud of them. They're incredible. I'm closer with some of them than others, and that's just the nature of how these things work out.
Yeah, I mean, you know, also there's 10 of you. I'm sure there's age gaps that are...
Yeah. And my youngest brother, like, I think I just now have contact with him after 6 years or something. So there's like a lot of like that too that happened, that is not directly related to the cult, but we also don't really talk about that a lot. It's very triggering. We all also have different experiences with it. Like, I have a very extreme experience with it, and then there are some of my siblings who didn't have the extreme experience, and so it's hard for me sometimes to say this was my experience and it was horrible and horrific and still impacts every day of my life, and have siblings who don't have the same experience. And there are siblings who had it worse than I did. There's a lot of that, but we really don't talk about it. I think there is a huge aspect. There was a lot of pressure on us to be the perfect homeschooled family. And so the picture that we presented to everyone else sometimes carried into our relationships with each other. And that can be really hard. And so with some of them, I'm very close because we've had the hard conversations, and with others, that's just not an option, because either they did not experience it the same way, or some of them just straight up did not experience. Like, some of them grew up without the cult, and you know, And some of them grew up without my dad in the house, which changes everything. And I only experienced him for 3 days at a time, as opposed to those of us who grew up with him in the house all the time. So, yeah.
Wow. Well.
And this barely scratches the surface.
Yeah. I mean, I believe it. I don't know how you did it. Truly, like, it takes a certain kind of human to get out and go to therapy and get help and get a master's degree with like all of this trauma, this subpar high school experience that you had. Like, that's awesome. I mean, for lack of a better word, that's like incredible. And it seems like that while you experience all those things, your life is in a upward trajectory of sorts.
For sure. There is hope outside of it. And like, that's what I want people to kind of take away from this, because it's scary and it also gets sensationalized, and people watch TLC videos or shows and assume that that's what it looks like. That's not what it looks like. That is not what it looks like. And especially the getting out period, that's not what it looks like. It is hard work, but it is worth the work.
If there's one thing for you to tell someone who maybe is in it, is on the edge of getting out, you kind of were talking about already.
Yeah.
What would you tell them?
That's a really hard one, because I don't know that people would listen, because of the way, like, if someone's about to get out, like, taking this step, I would say is really worth that. Like, it is scary, but there's a lot of people who have gotten out and who have really good, beautiful lives. I would say you are worth so much more than what they taught you that you are worth. Especially for women, you are worth more than being a meek, submissive wife. That is not what your life has to look like. And also, you get to say no, and you get to have an opinion, and you get to do what you want to do with your life and not what they're telling you that you should do. And also that this isn't what godly people do. This is not, the majority of people are not like that. Like, if you can get out, there's so much more beauty in the world when you can get out and you meet people outside of that group of people. I also just I have a very soft spot for queer kids growing up in that community, because you're not evil. Like, you are not going to hell for the way that you love. The way you love is so beautiful.
Yeah.
And it should be expressed, and you should not feel shame for that. And also go to therapy. Just go to therapy.
Everyone go to therapy, but especially
especially if you grew up in a cult.
Yeah. Wow. I thank you so much. And I feel like this is not the last time I'm going to have you on my channel, because, we're just scratching the surface, like you said, and there's so much more to talk about. And, my love for, exposing cults and exposing scams and MLMs, but in particular, I have a very, very soft spot for religious cults. Yeah. Just because I grew up in one, and, not to the extreme. Sorry, my dog just shook. She hears the excitement, not to the extreme of the IBLP, but, nonetheless a cult. And I know how awful and hard it can be to share your story, but you did it incredibly. And
thank you.
It is going to impact so many people. Like, you sharing your story like this, whether 1,000 people see it or 10,000 people see it or whatever, it's going to leave a ripple, right? It's going to leave a ripple effect. And, the more voices like yours that are out there, the more people are going to see and realize that maybe something's going on that we should look more into. So thank you so much, Aryn. Thank you so much.
You're welcome.
And you're awesome. And I'm so honored to have you on my channel and to have interviewed you. I guess this is where we say goodbye. Okay. Well, thank you so much. And
thank you.
I'm sure a lot of people will have questions in the comments.
Yes. Please ask questions. I love talking. So ask all the questions.
Yeah. And stuff they want to tell you. And I encourage people to leave encouragement for you, right? Because it's not easy to do this. So thank you so much. And I hope to talk to you soon.
Thank you.
Bye, Aryn.
Bye.
Show you what I'm all about. Make up for what we lost. Tonight is the night that we're gonna fall in love. I don't care about you and him. I don't care about what has been. only care about yours.